A millionaire lost everything he had in 1 second, but he met a boy and what he gave him changed the world. At precisely 40 years old, Nathaniel Vale was a man whose name once summoned awe in penthouse circles, whispered in stock market halls and printed in gold leaf on the covers of glossy business magazines. He had crafted an empire from the bones of broken buildings, reviving derelict properties and transforming them into monuments of wealth. Every inch of his world gleamed with certainty, confidence, and excess. And then, in the span of 3 months, it all fell apart. The collapse began with a whisper, an unexpected audit, a frozen account, a partner vanishing to an uncharted island. But by the time Nathaniel truly grasped the scale of the disaster, his reputation was ash, his property seized, and his name blacklisted from every reputable firm. A man once flanked by drivers, advisors, and flattery now wandered lower Manhattan with a cracked phone and shoes 2 winters old. Nathaniel took to sleeping in the rusting cab of an abandoned food truck near a shipping yard. His breath fogged the cracked window at night, and in the silence, he often imagined the tick of his Rolex, long gone, sold for a night at a decent motel. Pride had not died, but it had been quieted, subdued under the weight of truth. Then, one evening blurred with hunger and fatigue, as Nathaniel sat on the concrete outside an all-night laundromat, it happened. A boy, small, tattered, and strangely alert, appeared beside him. No introduction, no hesitation. The child held out a paper bag of warm, greasy food, as though offering it to a friend, not a stranger. "You dropped this," the boy said, and Nathaniel, puzzled, took it with a slow hand. "I didn't," he began, but the boy was already sitting beside him, legs crossed, biting into his own sandwich. They ate in silence for several minutes before the boy spoke again. "You're not from around here." Nathaniel almost laughed. "You could say that. You used to have a lot of money." This time, he turned to look. The boy's eyes were sharp, not unkind, but ancient somehow. "What makes you think that? Your watch tan. Your shoes are good leather, just worn down. And you don't talk like the guys who sleep under bridges." Nathaniel said nothing. He'd been many things, a tycoon, a negotiator, a thief in the eyes of some, but never had he been so thoroughly observed. He was impressed. And disarmed. The boy stood suddenly, brushing crumbs from his hoodie. "Come on." "To where?" "There's a place. Better than this. I sleep there sometimes. And there's a guy who owes me a favor. Maybe he'll help you." It should have sounded ridiculous. Following a child in the dead of night to an undisclosed location? But Nathaniel was past dignity. The only currency he had left was trust, and he was prepared to spend it. They moved through alleyways and over rusting fences, arriving eventually at what appeared to be an auto garage long since closed. The boy tapped a coded rhythm on the side door, and it opened. Inside was warmth, music, and a strange harmony of organized chaos. People moved with purpose. A young man in oil-stained coveralls raised an eyebrow. "Matthew. You brought company?" "He's useful." The boy, Matthew, replied simply. "He just doesn't remember how to be." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I'm standing right here." The young man smirked. "Good. We need a brain. Maybe he can help with the books." Over the next days, then weeks, Nathaniel learned that this place, dubbed the Latch, was more than shelter. It was in operation. Underground but not criminal, it refurbished stolen potential, runaways, orphans, lost veterans. People like Nathaniel. He offered advice, repaired the broken system they used to barter and trade, and slowly reawakened the fire he'd thought long dead. The boy, Matthew, was always nearby, silent, watchful, endlessly curious. Then came the twist. One afternoon, digging through old financial ledgers of the garage, Nathaniel found a name. A very familiar one. A company. His company. But the document was dated 10 years back. And scrawled across the corner, asset seizure, custody transfer, Matthew Vale. His blood froze. He stormed into the garage's back room where Matthew was sketching a circuit. "Where did you get your name?" Matthew looked up calmly. It was given to me. By the orphanage. And your parents? Matthew hesitated. Then, softly, they said I was left with a note. No one claimed me. Just a locket. It had initials A.V. Nathaniel swayed on his feet. A.V. Andrea Vale. His sister. Gone in a fire 12 years ago. Her son had disappeared, presumed lost. And now. Matthew, he said, voice low. You're not just a boy I met on the street. The boy stared at him, waiting. Your family. In that instant, Nathaniel Vale knew he hadn't just been given a second chance at life. He'd been given a second life itself. But claiming him, would be far from simple. The revelation hovered in the air like thick smoke, unspoken yet undeniable. Nathaniel Vale stood rooted to the garage floor, his mind torn between disbelief and awakening. Across from him, the boy, his blood, fidgeted with a copper wire, unaware that his identity had just detonated inside the man who once ruled half the skyline. That night, Nathaniel didn't sleep. He lay on a thin mattress in the corner of the makeshift dormitory, eyes tracing the ceiling's shadowy beams. Questions curled and twisted in his mind like vines. Could it be coincidence? Had he simply projected his desperation for purpose onto the boy? Or was fate far more intricate than he had allowed himself to believe? At dawn, he retrieved the ledger again, examining the scrawled note in the margins. Matthew Vale. Custody transfer. A.V. And beneath the faded ink, a symbol. A crescent hidden within a circle. It meant nothing to him at first. But hours later, it struck him like a bolt. It was his sister's mark. Andrea had drawn it on the corner of every letter she wrote, an old family joke. A moon for her solitude, a circle for the world she kept at arm's length. This wasn't coincidence. It was a breadcrumb. Left behind by a hand extinguished too early. He needed proof. And he knew where to get it. By late morning, he was in a downtown legal office, a place he'd once owned through a web of shell companies. The receptionist did not recognize the unshaven man in thrifted clothes. That was a blessing. I need to see Richard Crane, he told her. I'm a former client. Name? Nathaniel Vale. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. Sir, Mr. Crane is in a meeting. Tell him it's about Andrea Vale. That did it. Within 10 minutes, Nathaniel sat across from Richard Crane, a man whose memory was as formidable as his loyalty. My God! Crane muttered, leaning back. Nathaniel. You look. Like I've been trampled by irony and debt? Yes. Crane didn't laugh. You disappeared. After the collapse. I know. But I need your help now more than ever. And then, slowly, carefully, Nathaniel laid it all out, the boy, the orphanage, the name, the mark. Crane listened without interruption, the way he had during hostile takeovers and boardroom wars. When Nathaniel was done, Crane stood and disappeared into a locked cabinet. From it, he pulled a faded envelope, sealed in wax. After Andrea's death, there was uncertainty. A child was listed as missing. Presumed perished. But this, he placed the envelope on the table, was sent anonymously 6 months after the fire. I never showed it to you. Why not? Crane hesitated. Because you were unraveling, Nathaniel. Angry. Dangerous. And because I thought it was a hoax. Until now. Nathaniel opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, a birth certificate fragment. The name, Matthew. No last name. No father listed. Mother, Andrea Vale. The time matched. The locket, the symbol, the boy. Matthew was his nephew. And for reasons that burned behind Crane's silence, someone had wanted that child hidden. Nathaniel left the office with a new fire in his chest. Back at the garage, Matthew was repairing a drone with surgical precision, eyes narrowed behind cracked safety goggles. Nathaniel crouched beside him, the envelope in his hand. Do you know your mother's name? He asked gently. Matthew blinked. Only the first. Andrea. Nathaniel exhaled. She was my sister. The boy's eyes narrowed, not with disbelief, but with the kind of wariness life on the streets had taught him. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve the truth. You're not just a kid in the system. You're my family. And I failed you. Years ago. I didn't know you existed. But now that I do, he faltered, voice thickening. I want to fix this. Matthew set down his tool. His face unreadable. Fix what? The world? Or your guilt? Nathaniel flinched. But he nodded. Both. There was silence then, stretching long and taut. I don't want charity, Matthew said finally. I don't want a castle or servants. I just want a name that means something. And a life that doesn't vanish when people forget. Nathaniel stared at him, heart heavy. Then let's build that together. But the next twist was already forming, like a wave just beyond sight. That evening, as Nathaniel prepared to start the official process to claim custody, a visitor came to the latch. A tall, narrow man in a gray wool coat and polished shoes. He moved like someone who'd never been told no. His name was Deacon Hart. He introduced himself to Matthew first. I knew your mother, he said, extending a gloved hand. And I know the truth about what happened to her. And to you. Matthew froze. Nathaniel appeared behind him instantly. And who are you? He demanded. Deacon smiled thinly. Let's just say I'm the man who kept your nephew alive when the world forgot he existed. But if you want that story, we're going to have to make a deal. Nathaniel's fists clenched. I've lost everything. I'm not making any more deals. Deacon's eyes glinted. Then you might lose him too. The night was quiet, but inside Nathaniel, a storm raged. The man in the gray coat, Deacon Hart, stood calmly at the threshold of everything Nathaniel had begun to rebuild. His voice had been smooth, but his words carried barbs. I knew your mother, he had said to Matthew, with a gloved hand extended. And I know the truth about what happened to her. And to you. Nathaniel positioned himself instinctively between them. His mind scanned everything he knew, or thought he knew. Deacon Hart was no ghost. He was a name from old investor circles. A strategist of the shadows. A man who profited from collapse and dealt in secrets rather than stocks. What do you want? Nathaniel's voice was low, measured. He didn't trust himself with more. Deacon smiled, not cruelly, but with something worse, certainty. I came to offer you the one thing you don't have, he said. Closure. I don't need closure. I need truth. And truth, Deacon replied softly, has never been free. Matthew watched them both, his face unreadable, his hands tucked in his sleeves like he was bracing for cold. Deacon stepped forward. Andrea Vale and I were partners. Not romantically. Strategically. She came to me when she had nowhere else to go. She was hiding. From what, I wasn't sure. But I helped her. I helped her disappear. Nathaniel's breath caught. Disappear from me? No, Deacon said, eyeing him. From something far worse. Something you were too entangled in to even see. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin folder. He handed it to Nathaniel with the grace of a man handing over a menu. Inside were documents. A timeline. Birth certificates. Hospital records. Bank slips under false names. All surrounding a woman named Andrea Vale, and a child labeled simply as M. You're lying, Nathaniel muttered, flipping through the papers. I'm not. I'm offering you a chance to finish what your sister started. She protected that boy with her life. Hid him so that the same machine that chewed you up wouldn't consume him too. And now, here we are. The machine is gone. You're broken. And the boy is still exposed. What do you want in return? Deacon's gaze flicked to Matthew, then back to Nathaniel. There's a ledger. Hidden in your old empire. Andrea buried it before the fire. She never told me where. But she left signs. I believe he nodded toward Matthew, is the key. I've waited 7 years for this. Nathaniel shook his head. You're using him. No. Deacon said calmly. You were using him. Until last week, he was just a spark in your dark. Now he's your nephew. That changes everything, doesn't it? Silence. Matthew stepped forward. What kind of ledger? Deacon turned to him, surprisingly gentle. The kind people would kill for. The kind your mother died for. Nathaniel's chest tightened. If we find it, what happens to you? Deacon shrugged. I walk away. I have no interest in destroying what little you have left. I just want what's mine. And if we say no? The smile vanished from Deacon's lips. Then you'll never know what really happened to Andrea. And neither will he. He turned without waiting for an answer and stepped out into the night. Nathaniel and Matthew stood in silence for a long time. Finally, Matthew spoke. If there's something she left behind, I want to know. Even if it hurts. Nathaniel nodded. Slowly. Then whispered, So do I. The following morning was cold and gray, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the city like a lid. Nathaniel awoke early, though sleep had barely touched him. He sat upright on the thin mattress in the garage office, Deacon's folder still resting unopened beside him. He hadn't looked at it since the previous night. Not because he feared what was inside, but because he feared what it might make him do. Across the room, Matthew was curled up under a patchwork quilt, unmoving. In slumber, he looked impossibly young. Fragile. And yet Nathaniel now understood, he carried more than just a resemblance to his mother. He carried something buried. A link. A code. By noon, Matthew stood at the same table, the folder finally opened between them. Pages were spread like puzzle pieces. Some bore official stamps, government, hospital, even shell company logos Nathaniel recognized from his own forgotten business empire. But others were scribbled notes in Andrea's handwriting. Cryptic, half-poetic phrases. Beneath the silver lion, where glass forgets to reflect. Matthew read aloud. Nathaniel frowned. She always did love riddles. Could be a place. Matthew offered. A statue? A building? Nathaniel's eyes widened. Wait, the Silver Lion. That was the nickname for the first tower I built. It was a mixed-use skyscraper. The penthouse level had mirrored floors. But there was one room with matte glass. She designed it. Matthew tilted his head. She was an architect? Nathaniel paused. She wanted to be. I never let her in. I told her business was no place for family. There was silence. Maybe this is her way of proving you wrong, Matthew said softly. By early afternoon they were on the move. Nathaniel had a contact, an old maintenance chief who still owed him a favor. By sunset they'd slipped into the Silver Lion Tower through a forgotten sub-basement stairwell. The building, now under new ownership, had changed, but not enough to erase the past. Nathaniel led Matthew up 14 flights by foot, avoiding cameras, bypassing locked corridors with codes he remembered from muscle memory. Finally they reached it, the matte glass room. It had once been a gallery. Now it stood abandoned, hollow and sterile. But Nathaniel saw it immediately, the anomaly. One panel in the mirrored wall didn't quite fit. It was slightly crooked. Matthew approached first. He tapped it with his knuckles. Hollow. Nathaniel reached up, pried it gently. The panel swung open with a creak. Inside, hidden within a cavity no bigger than a kitchen drawer, lay a small metal box. Cold. Heavy. Locked. There was no key. Instead, on the top, etched faintly MV. Matthew stared. I think she meant it for me, he whispered. Nathaniel handed the box over. Then open it. Matthew hesitated, then turned it slowly in his hands. On the underside, he found a sliding panel, almost invisible. With a gentle push, it opened. Inside were three things. A photo of Andrea, holding a baby wrapped in blue. A thin black notebook, bound in cracked leather. And a flash drive, unlabeled. Matthew held the photo with trembling fingers. That's me. Nathaniel took the notebook, flipping it open. Andrea's handwriting. Dated 7 days before the fire. If you're reading this, you've found what they never could. This ledger contains names, accounts, deals I wasn't supposed to know. People Nathaniel trusted. People I didn't. I hid it not to punish him, but to protect the only thing that mattered, my son. If anything happens to me, protect him. He is the only part of me worth saving. Nathaniel's hands shook. She knew they were coming. Matthew looked up. What's on the drive? We'll find out. But before they could move, the silence shattered. A click. A shadow at the doorway. Deacon Hart. Clapping slowly. Well done, he said, stepping inside. Nathaniel shielded the boy instinctively. How did you find us? I never lost you. I let you come this far. Because I knew she wouldn't make it easy. Andrea was brilliant. Paranoid. And thorough. Matthew's jaw clenched. You said you helped her. I did. I helped her disappear. But I also helped build the empire that tried to destroy her. We were both in too deep. He held out his hand. Give me the drive. Nathaniel shook his head. Not a chance. Deacon's eyes darkened. You don't understand what's on it. It doesn't just implicate former partners. It implicates men who are still in power. People who will kill for it. That's exactly why we can't give it to you, Nathaniel said. Deacon's voice dropped to a near whisper. Then you'd better prepare. Because now they'll come for you. And with that, he vanished into the stairwell, leaving behind a silence more dangerous than any noise. For several long seconds, Nathaniel and Matthew stood frozen, the cold box still cradled in the boy's hands. The faint echo of Deacon's retreating footsteps seemed to stretch into eternity. Then Nathaniel moved. Grab the drive. We're leaving. They retraced their steps swiftly through the service stairwell, each echoing footfall now sounding like a trigger. Matthew kept glancing over his shoulder, clutching the notebook tightly. He hadn't said a word since Deacon left, but his silence was sharper than fear. It was focus. By the time they exited the tower, dusk had deepened into night. The streets buzzed with blind movement, cars, faces, noise, but Nathaniel felt it, a new kind of danger, watching from somewhere just out of sight. Back at the garage, the others sensed something was wrong. Nathaniel dismissed them quickly, locking himself and Matthew inside the back room. A single desk lamp lit the space. They inserted the flash drive into a dusty old laptop. What appeared on screen made Nathaniel's throat go dry. Bank accounts. Offshore transfers. Code names he recognized, former partners, government contacts, even charities that had been laundering fronts. And at the top, a list marked Black Sun beneficiaries. He scrolled through the names, then stopped. One line glowed like fire. Nathaniel Vale. His own name. Beside it, the figure, $18.4 million. Date 3 weeks before Andrea's death. Matthew's voice cut the silence. You were part of it. No. Nathaniel breathed. I never saw this. I never. He paused. Realization blooming with horror. They used my name. My signature. Someone planted this. Or someone inside did it. He stood abruptly. The air felt thinner. I need to find Crane. Who's Crane? The only man who knew what my sister feared. But when Nathaniel called, the line rang once, then a voice answered. It wasn't Crane. Mr. Vale, said a stranger. Calm. Cold. Mr. Crane is unavailable. Nathaniel froze. Who is this? A man who is now very interested in what you've recovered. You've made noise, Mr. Vale. The kind of noise that calls vultures. Click. The line went dead. Nathaniel turned to Matthew, his face pale. We're not safe anymore. Matthew didn't blink. We never were. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed hard. The empire Nathaniel once built was not just flawed, it was poisoned. Andrea had seen it early. She tried to protect her son from its shadow. And now, that shadow had found them. We can't run, Matthew said firmly. She didn't hide this just so we'd bury it again. Nathaniel met his eyes. For the first time, he saw in Matthew not just the boy, but the echo of Andrea's strength. Her fire. No, Nathaniel said slowly. We exposed them. All of them. A knock rattled the metal garage door. 3 slow taps. Then silence. Nathaniel grabbed the drive. Matthew clutched the notebook. Another knock. This time, 2 quick, 1 long. Nathaniel's blood turned cold. That was the old signal. One used only by Andrea? But she was dead. Wasn't she? Nathaniel's hand hovered above the door latch. The knock still echoed in his mind. 1 long, 2 short, 1 long again. He hadn't heard that pattern in over a decade, not since the nights he and Andrea used it to communicate secretly across their family estate, back when the world was still whole. Matthew stood silent beside him, gripping the drive. Who would know that code? The boy whispered. No one, Nathaniel replied. No one alive. The knock repeated, exactly the same. He opened the door. Rain streaked the alley, and in its mist stood a figure in a soaked trench coat, head lowered beneath the hood. Slowly she raised her face. Nathaniel's breath left him. She was older. Paler. But the eyes were unmistakable, storm gray, burning with purpose. Hello, Nate, Andrea Vale said. Matthew staggered backward. You're alive, she said, stepping inside. Barely. Nathaniel stared at her, trying to believe what he saw. His sister. Dead for 7 years. Buried, mourned, grieved. You died in the fire, he managed. She removed the soaked coat, revealing scars along her neck and wrists. They wanted me dead. I let them think they succeeded. How? Nathaniel's voice cracked. Andrea sat, drenched boots squeaking on the floor. I was warned. The night before. Someone inside Black Sun tipped me off. I barely made it out. Matthew was already gone, placed in hiding under Deacon's arrangements. Nathaniel clenched his fists. Deacon said he helped you. Andrea nodded. He did. Then he betrayed me. She turned to Matthew, eyes softening. I watched from far away. You grew strong. Smarter than I ever imagined. Matthew stepped closer, tears caught between disbelief and fury. You left me. Andrea didn't flinch. I left to keep you alive. The room fell into heavy silence. Then Nathaniel spoke. You knew about the ledger. The names. My name. Andrea looked at him, gaze steady. They used you, Nate. Framed you. You were reckless, but not cruel. You didn't kill me. But you built the doors they walked through. He nodded slowly. And now they're walking back. Andrea turned to Matthew. You have the notebook? He handed it over. Andrea opened the leather cover with reverence. I planted pieces in multiple places. The drive you found is only one. There's more. But they'll come for it. Already have, Nathaniel muttered. Crane's gone. Andrea's face tightened. Then it's begun. She opened a compartment in her coat and pulled out a second drive. This holds a backdoor to one of the main accounts. If we access it, we control the last untouched funds of Black Sunday. Nathaniel frowned. We expose them through their own money? No, Andrea said. We destroyed them through it. A sudden crack split the silence. A bullet against the garage wall. Then another. The window shattered. Down! Nathaniel shouted, pulling Matthew to the floor. Andrea flipped the desk. They found us. Shouts outside. Boots on pavement. The hiss of tires. They're not here to negotiate, she said. Nathaniel reached for the hidden trapdoor behind the tool cabinet. There's a tunnel. Old delivery shaft. He yanked it open. Andrea nodded. We run now. We strike later. Matthew slid in first, gripping both drives. Nathaniel followed, then Andrea. As they crawled into the dark, the last thing Nathaniel heard was the metal door above them splitting open. Not a rescue. Not mercy. An execution delayed. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and choked with the scent of rust and mildew. For over a decade, it had been nothing more than a forgotten passage beneath the city, a relic of an older, more industrial era. But now it cradled three fugitives bound together not by blood alone, but by secrets too dangerous to name aloud. Matthew crawled first, his arms trembling from tension, both drives secured in the pouch of his hoodie. Nathaniel followed, whispering directions. He remembered this route from his early days developing the district. It had once been used for covert freight deliveries, an invisible artery below the skyline he once ruled. Andrea moved behind them, steady, quiet. She hadn't spoken since they dropped into the tunnel, but Nathaniel could feel her watching everything, calculating each risk, measuring the length of every silence. After nearly 30 minutes of crawling, they reached an iron hatch. Nathaniel braced himself and heaved it upward. With a groan and a puff of stale air, it opened into the basement of an abandoned print shop, one of the last properties still legally in his name. They emerged, soaked and breathless. Matthew collapsed onto a crate, wiping grime from his face with his sleeve. Andrea, inspecting the space, finally broke the silence. "They'll search the garage. They'll find traces of us." Nathaniel locked the hatch behind them. "Then this is our last shadow. After this, we're in open air." "We're not ready for open air," Andrea replied sharply. Matthew looked up. "We can't keep running. The more we hide, the more they erase." Andrea turned to him, surprised not by his words, but the steadiness in his voice. "We need to go public," the boy continued. "You said the second drive gives us access to the core account." Andrea hesitated. "Yes." "Then let's use it. Not to steal. To leak." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about exposure." Matthew nodded. "Release everything. Names, numbers, dates. Let the world judge." Andrea shook her head. "You don't understand. These people own more than companies. They own courts. Newsrooms. Entire governments. A leak won't bring justice, it'll bring death. Fast and wide." But Nathaniel was staring at the old press machines around them. Rusted giants, once used to print thousands of papers a day. "What if," he said slowly, "we don't go digital?" Andrea raised an eyebrow. "You want to print it? On paper?" He nodded. 1,000 anonymous copies. Delivered by hand. No trails. No IPs. Just truth. And who's going to believe a stack of documents dropped on a doorstep? Andrea challenged. "The ones who've been waiting for someone else to go first," Nathaniel said. "If even one prosecutor, one journalist, one honest voice picks it up, we win." Andrea studied him. Then, slowly, she nodded. Matthew smiled faintly. Old school rebellion. That night, they worked in silence, side by side. Andrea decrypted the drive's contents, converting spreadsheets of crime into readable, furious prose. Nathaniel rewired the power to the old press machines, fingers trembling as he coaxed ancient gears back to life. And Matthew, ever precise, organized addresses, cross-checking names with publicly traceable data. By dawn, the first printout emerged, a bold headline in black ink. "The names you've never been allowed to know." Underneath, lists, account trails, fake charities, secret meetings. A web, tangled and inescapable. Andrea held it up. Her voice was calm. "Once we release this, there's no taking it back." Matthew reached for the stack, sliding fresh pages onto the feeder. "Good," he said. "Then we're finally doing something that matters." Before noon, 30 thick envelopes had been sealed and loaded into a courier van Nathaniel had stored from better days. No tracking numbers. No returns. Just a whisper, sent like a signal flare into the smog. By sunset, the first reaction arrived. A breaking report on a minor news blog, anonymous tip. Then another, larger, syndicated post. The files were spreading. The flame had caught. And then, just as the three of them began to exhale, thinking, perhaps, they'd moved faster than their enemies, a message appeared on Matthew's burner phone. No number. Just a sentence. "You had your turn." Now it's ours. Attached, a live photo of Richard Crane. Bound. Bruised. Still breathing. Somewhere unfamiliar. Andrea's face went cold. They want the rest of the drive. Matthew's voice was quiet. Then we finish what we started. Or he dies because of us. Nathaniel looked between them, his sister reborn, his nephew sharpened by truth, and knew they were past the point of safety. The truth had been printed. But the war had just begun. The warehouse air was heavy with ink and silence. The presses had stilled, but the weight of what had been printed hung thick in the room. 30 envelopes had gone out. 30 fires lit. And now, one image had brought the whole world back into shadow. Crane, tied to a chair, face bloodied, eyes wide with silent warning. They're letting him live, Andrea said, eyes fixed on the screen. For now. Matthew clenched his fists. Because they want something. Nathaniel nodded slowly. The second drive. The rest of the ledger. And they know we won't give it up, Andrea added. Not unless we have no choice. A pause. Or, Nathaniel said carefully, we make them think we will. Andrea looked at him sharply. You want to bait them? He met her gaze. We don't have power. We don't have resources. But we do have one thing they can't buy: attention. Public pressure. And fear. He pointed to the laptop. They showed us Crane to provoke a reaction. So let's give them one. Just not the one they expect. Andrea slowly smiled. You've finally learned how to bluff. Matthew looked between them. What's the plan? Andrea's eyes sharpened. We arrange a drop. Tell them we'll hand over the drive in exchange for Crane. They'll never honor that, Nathaniel said. Not once they have what they want. They won't have it, Andrea replied. Not the real one. She turned to Matthew. We make a fake. They spent the night forging the perfect copy. Matthew handled the technical mimicry, duplicating directories and file names from the original drive, while Andrea filled the data with carefully selected noise, enough truth to look convincing, but none of the kill shots. Nathaniel plotted the meeting site, an abandoned train platform on the edge of the river, isolated, perfect for an ambush, or a reckoning. By morning the message was sent. Tomorrow. 10 p.m. East Harbor platform. One drive for one man. No tricks. There was no reply. But they knew they'd come. The next night, the rain returned. Steady. Relentless. Like a curtain drawn across the sky. Nathaniel stood on the platform, soaked to the bone, the fake drive in his pocket. His breath clouded the air. Beside him, Andrea scanned the dark, fingers curled around a concealed piece of steel. Matthew waited further back, watching from a rooftop across the tracks, walkie pressed to his ear. Then headlights. A black SUV rolled to a stop. 2 men stepped out first, faces expressionless. And then a third figure emerged, stumbling, arms bound, face swollen. Crane. Andrea's jaw tightened. He's alive! Nathaniel stepped forward. One of the guards raised a hand. The drive. Nathaniel didn't move. Let him walk first. The guards exchanged a glance. Then, reluctantly, they cut Crane's binds and shoved him forward. He staggered, but stayed upright, blinking through the rain. Andrea caught him as he collapsed into her arms. Nathaniel stepped forward and held out the drive. Here, he said. The man took it, examined it, nodded. And then, without warning, he pulled a gun. Andrea's shout was lost in the roar of a single gunshot. But it wasn't aimed at Nathaniel. It came from above. Matthew on the roof. The guard fell instantly. Chaos erupted. Andrea dragged Crane toward cover. Nathaniel dove as the second guard fired, missing him by inches. Another shot from above, Matthew again. Precise. Furious. Within moments the platform was still. Only the rain moved. Nathaniel stood, breath heaving, and looked at the fallen bodies. Then up, Matthew's silhouette stood against the flickering skyline, the rifle shaking in his hands. He had never fired a gun before. Andrea ran to him as sirens began to wail in the distance. "We need to move," she said. "This was only one cell. There will be more." Nathaniel knelt beside Crane. The man coughed, eyes bloodshot. "You made them bleed." Nathaniel offered a hand. "We're not finished yet." Crane grasped it weakly. "Then you'd better run faster." Far behind them, the city lit up with blue and red. But Nathaniel Vale, for the first time in years, was running towards something: truth, vengeance, and a final reckoning. They didn't stop running until the city lights faded into a pale blur behind them. Somewhere beyond the highway, past the industrial outskirts, stood the last safe place Nathaniel could remember, an old farmhouse he had once purchased under a fake name for weekend escapes he never took. It had no power, no internet, no history. And now, it was sanctuary. Crane slept fitfully on the couch, bandaged and pale. His breathing was shallow but steady. Andrea watched over him like a hawk. She hadn't said a word since the shootout, but the tightness in her jaw never eased. Matthew sat on the floor beside an oil lamp, cross-legged, the real drive in his lap. He stared at it as if it were a ticking bomb. Nathaniel stood by the window, scanning the tree line. When he finally turned, his voice was low. "They'll come here." Andrea didn't look up. "Eventually. We need to end this." Matthew's fingers tightened around the drive. "How?" Andrea finally looked up. "There's one last vault. A server not listed in any network, off-grid, analog secured. Andrea's original storage. It holds the full, unedited ledger. The files we printed were only fragments." Nathaniel's heart skipped. "You mean the complete list is somewhere else?" Andrea nodded. "It was too dangerous to keep it all on a single drive. So I split the contents. The copy I had, and hid in that box, was just a key." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Where's the vault?" Andrea hesitated. Then she whispered, "Brookridge Asylum." Nathaniel blinked. "That place has been abandoned for years." "Exactly," she said. "That's why no one looked there." She stood, walked over to her coat, and retrieved a metal key, long, rusted, engraved with a strange sigil. "My contact hid the server behind one of the sealed wings. No one knows but me. And now you?" Matthew took a breath. "Then we go tonight." They reached Brookridge just past midnight. The asylum loomed like a forgotten cathedral, its windows black, its gates half-hanging from rusted hinges. Wind whispered through the corridors like ghosts warning them back. Nathaniel pushed open the main doors. Dust and decay choked the air. "This place reeks of the past," he muttered. Andrea led them through winding halls, their steps echoing. Finally, they reached an old steel door sealed with a mechanical lock. She inserted the key. It clicked. The door swung open to reveal a small room lined with decaying file cabinets, and in its center, a server rack humming faintly beneath layers of dust. Matthew stepped forward, reverent. "It's still alive." Andrea handed him a small USB with the decryption sequence. "Insert this. It'll open the archive." Nathaniel watched as Matthew connected the drive. For a moment, nothing. Then the screen lit up. Lines of data filled the display. Names, dates, financial networks, coded operations. From Eastern conglomerates to Western shell firms. Hundreds of entities. All tied together. All complicit. One name flashed across the screen: Red Crest Initiative. Nathaniel's blood ran cold. "I know that name," he said. "They backed my expansion into South Asia. But I thought they were a logistics firm." Andrea's face darkened. "They weren't. They were a cover for a trafficking syndicate. They moved more than cargo, Nathaniel. You built them a pipeline." He staggered back, staring at the names. His name, woven through it all like thread. Matthew's voice was soft. "You didn't know. But you can help end it." The server pinged. A message flashed. "External signal detected." Andrea's face went pale. "They found us." Nathaniel turned. We need to pull the data. Matthew worked fast, fingers flying. Just a few more minutes. Gunshots. From outside. Then shouting. Nathaniel grabbed a rusted fire axe from the wall. Andrea pulled a pistol from her coat. Matthew, finish the transfer, she ordered. No matter what happens. The door behind them slammed shut. Andrea's plan was simple: release the truth as a living thing. If one version was destroyed, another would rise. Like fire. Like fungus. Matthew dubbed it Project Echo, a chain of data across thousands of digital vaults, pre-scheduled to release at intervals unless manually stopped. A single truth, weaponized into permanence. The ledger was now everywhere. Every major investigative outlet had it. Whistleblower forums lit up with mirrored files. An anonymous email was sent to every regulatory body across 3 continents. No traceable source. No signature. Just one line attached to the zip file. Truth delayed is justice denied. Within 48 hours, the effect began. The first headlines were tentative. Unknown leak claims global collusion among financial giants. Billionaire names appear in black market trafficking records. But by the 3rd day, they exploded. International arrest warrants issued following data exposure. Congressman resigns amid ledger scandal. Interpol confirms the Red Crest initiative was real. It was unstoppable. Politicians denied. Executives vanished. Accounts froze across offshore banks. And the name Andrea Vail, once buried, resurfaced in fiery ink. Yet the victory was not sweet. On the 4th night, Andrea didn't wake up. She sat in an old armchair by the boarded window, the same position she'd taken when she insisted on the final watch. Her pistol rested in her lap. Her head tilted against the worn cushion, peaceful. Nathaniel approached slowly, calling her name once, twice. Then stopped. Her breath was gone. Not from wounds. From everything. The chase. The exile. The war she had carried for a decade. He knelt before her and bowed his head. Matthew stood behind him, eyes hollow. He didn't cry. He didn't move. Just stood there in the flickering lamplight, the final drive still hanging from a cord around his neck. We should have had more time, Nathaniel whispered. No, Matthew said. She gave us all the time we needed. They buried her behind the farmhouse. No gravestone. Just a small metal disc, engraved with her mark, the crescent moon inside a circle. She had started the fire. They would carry it forward. 3 weeks later, Nathaniel Vail sat in a courtroom for the first time, not as a financier, not as a benefactor, but as a witness. His confession was public, unflinching. He admitted to his ignorance, his complicity, his greed. And he offered every remaining name, account, and record still buried in the vaults of his mind. Some called him a coward seeking redemption. Some called him brave. He didn't care. Let them write their own endings. What mattered was that people were listening. Matthew watched it all from the gallery. No longer the boy in the shadows. He wore a worn suit now. His shoes still old. His stare still sharp. But something had changed in his posture, like a boy who had been a passenger all his life had finally taken the wheel. After the final session, he waited for Nathaniel outside the courthouse. You did good, he said. I did what was right. For once. Nathaniel smirked. Andrea would have said the same. Matthew looked up at the gray sky. She left us the truth, he said. And we turned it loose. Nathaniel reached into his coat and handed him a folded letter. She also left you this. I didn't read it. Matthew unfolded the page slowly. Andrea's handwriting, elegant, careful. Matthew. If you're reading this, then I am gone, but not lost. You are stronger than I ever dreamed, and braver than I ever taught you to be. The world will try to shape you into someone useful. Let it fail. Be inconvenient. Be honest. Be unafraid. And never forget, they only win when we stop showing up. You are my best decision. Mom. Matthew folded the letter carefully, slid it into his coat pocket, and nodded once. Then he turned and walked into the morning without looking back. Months later, in a quiet part of the city, a new foundation opened, the Veil Trust. Its mission: expose corruption, defend whistleblowers, and teach resilience to children who had none. At the front of the modest office, a single photograph hung in a simple black frame. A woman in a rain-soaked coat, her arms around a boy. No caption. No explanation. But anyone who worked there understood. Nathaniel never returned to wealth. He never rebuilt an empire. And he never wore a tailored suit again. Instead, he worked in the trust's back office, sorting letters, training analysts, reviewing the same kind of paperwork that once destroyed lives. He didn't complain. He didn't want to lead. He just wanted to show up. And Matthew? He grew. He traveled. He became something more than his past. Not a symbol. Not a weapon. Just a voice. One of many. And though the world still twisted and turned, some things were now different. Because the truth had not been deleted. It had been planted. And every time someone found it, they knew. Someone, somewhere, once decided not to stay silent. And that was how the fire kept burning.